Hi, I'm Craig Smith, and this is Eye on AI. This is the second episode in a two-part series that began with Yoshua Bengio and Julian Serban talking about AI for education. Today we speak with David Yi and Johan Lee from Reed Labs, the leading startup in the field. Reed Labs, based in Silicon Valley, is the global headquarters for Reed, a Korean startup that has built an AI tutoring system available through both smartphone apps targeting the test prep market and back-end white label systems being adopted by some of the largest education publishers in the world today. David and Johan spoke about Reed's vision of democratizing education by making personalized instruction available to anyone in the world with an internet-connected device. They spoke as well about the family of algorithms behind their system and the recently concluded Reed AI Ed Challenge, a Kaggle competition that engaged more than 3,000 teams across the world in developing knowledge tracing algorithms using Reed's EdNet dataset, the world's largest dataset of student-system interactions. The results of that challenge will be discussed on February 9th during an AI in Education workshop organized by Reed at AAAI 2021 or AAAI 2021. I hope you find the conversation as fascinating as I did. Let's start with David and then Johan introducing yourselves, and I'm interested in hearing about your career to date, how you got to Reed, and what each of your roles at Reed are.
Yeah, my name is David Yi. I'm the CEO of Reed Labs, which is a subsidiary of Reed, which is in Korea. Reed Labs is a Silicon Valley company, and we're a US company with a lot of cool people here. My background, I'm not an AI scientist. I'm not a mechanical computer scientist either. I have a penchant for it, but I'm all about people, the how and the who and the why of the people. It all started in the Peace Corps while I was in China working with people there. There's a certain pattern when it comes to the dynamics, social dynamics, and just interactions of people. And that was the beginning of my quote unquote educational career, teaching and just getting involved in the full spectrum of education. And education is in a spectrum. And I don't mean K through lifelong learning kind of spectrum, but I mean from the student to the teacher to the administration to the business to the scope, the curricula. I've done it all, the entire vertical and horizontal. And you come to learn a lot about humanity because everyone, if you talk to anybody, they all say that education is the most important social ladder. It's the most important empowerment tool. But little do people know that there's nothing more convoluted and confusing and impure than education. So that's my background, but I've been as well the head of Asia of ACT as well as K12.com, both big education companies. I've done a few startups, exited a few, but I feel that I've learned my chops at ACT and K12. And I met Reed while I was at a conference. And it blew my mind what the AI is doing for the world of education. I came in from an educational perspective. And the rest is history, as they would say.
So, Johan, what about you?
So for me, I may look a little bit more traditional for you, kind of like David, almost like I was destined for this role. My academic training, I started out in neuroscience, molecular neuroscience in particular, around learning and memory, cognition, et cetera. And then did my PhD at UCLA in genomics, big data, data science, machine learning meets the brain, and in that time, cancer. I was fortunate enough to do a postdoc over at the National Institutes of Health, namely the National Institute of Mental Health, where you start chasing after much harder diseases that are much more rare with a lot less characterization on the molecular and genomic scale. And then from there, I went into strategic and technical consulting at Booz Allen Hamilton for a number of years, getting a chance to build really big machine learning and data science systems for civilian health, pharma, and then also for civil and defense. And then Google Brain shortly after that for a few years, specifically in deployment, and then Reed Labs just a few months ago. What I do here at Reed is I'm head of strategy.
Education has sort of broken down even pre-COVID, but COVID accelerated a lot of the problems. Maybe, David, you can start talking about how you see AI and education solving some of those problems.
Certainly. I mentioned previously during my introduction how there's nothing more noble yet convoluted and impure as education. And that's because people bring their agendas to education. It's often not about the pupil or the student. It's often about the money, the politics, the teacher, and the teachers bring their insecurities sometimes. Not all teachers. I'm just saying that we're humans and we're able to do that and we're allowed to do it. And that's the thing about education. I don't think you can find any country in the world that would disagree with the following statement. Education is the most important spending in our national budget. Everyone will agree to that. I mean, it'd be bad policy not to, right? But the problem with education has been manifold. I mean, by region, you can isolate problems, right? In the United States, we have a disparity in education. It's just a problem. If you go to Asia, it's overheated. They're spending way too much on education. It's crazy. And if you go to Latin America or Africa, 50% or more of the population, their literacy rate and their math abilities just aren't cutting it. And yet, if you think about the bright side of education, there's never been a time in the history of humankind where education has been so unitized. We study the same math, the same English language, the same sciences. History, everyone can disagree here and there, but overall, this problem, quote unquote, of education should have been solved a few decades ago, but it hasn't. It persists. And now in comes AI. And this is pre-COVID, right? Because Reed, we were founded in 2014, and it started as an AI company. And I mean, if you take 3 steps back and look at the promise of AI, it can predict, it should be neutral, right? Non-judgmental. It should be eternally patient, right? I mean, there's all these promises, and that's what's so exciting about AI, right? The practical integration of AI into education, we're just at the beginning of a lot of that, and it's so exciting. Now, what we've been doing pre-COVID is based on data, based on pattern, based on user interaction, we've been able to greatly reduce, for example, a 3-hour test to 10 minutes. I mean, if you let that sit for a few seconds, that's extremely powerful, the value proposition behind that. I mean, it's a tiny, tiny, narrow, one-angle perspective of it, but it's the beginning of a big start, which is when we think AI and education, you can think so many grand things. Oh, personalize this, personalize that. Oh, what does it mean replacing teachers and whatnot? But all of that is just nonsense a little bit because we have to start from a low-hanging fruit of what we can tackle, right? Before we try to climb Mount Kilimanjaro, let's think about the hill in front of us. And the hill in front of us is that standardized exams suck. They are terrible, right? You can stand on whichever side. I'm, for one, as an alumnus of ACT, I'm a proponent of some sort of objective measure. It's honest. You don't want a subjective academic process. That's terrible. You want some objective measure. However, when it's 3 hours long, when it's been integrated into the system this long, and when people have figured out a way to game it, that's when you have to take a few steps back and redo the system. We've been gaming that system for 60 plus years, and in the United States alone, the ACT, SAT, all these systems. It hasn't changed for nearly a century. So when AI comes in, if you come back to that proposition that, hey, these 3-hour long tests, in 10 minutes with a 98% accuracy, you can predict not only the student score, but you can know what they're weak at, strong at, what they'll get wrong before they even choose it. You can even predict when they're getting tired. You can optimize a learning sequence and process for them. Then suddenly it's so powerful, right? The assessment itself becomes formative. It's not just a conclusive one test value judgment on the student. It becomes a formative learning process because you're micro-assessing them, low stakes, multiple times throughout a school semester or a school year. So that proposition is what's exciting. That's what we've kind of mounted on pre-COVID. And then when COVID happened, it accelerated everything. We thought we're 10 years out until people are ready to adopt a sort of technology or an environment where students are able to take micro quizzes and interdispersed micro quizzes with learning, that kind of environment. But with COVID, now that people can't get to a physical location and everything's asynchronized anyways, we're finding a lot more people adopting this, eagerness to adopt this kind of mode, this environment. So that's exciting.
This idea of sort of continuous micro testing, In fact, if you have a system, and I'm not sure that Reed's system can do this yet, but if you have a system that a student's interacting with on a daily or weekly basis, and that system can predict student scores at that point in time and can assess what the learning path they should follow for optimal results should be, it sort of obviates the need for standardized testing, doesn't it? A standardized test is a snapshot that people cram to get ready for. They take the picture and then there's no follow-up. But if you have a system that's continually evaluating the student, you don't need that snapshot. You know at any point in time where they are and what the likely outcome is. Is that right?
Exactly. I mean, what you just said is on point. It's the purpose and intent behind the assessment, right? This assessment of learning. So everything the student learned, are you assessing them? And so it's a judgment, right? Hey, you learned it. You didn't learn it. You suck. You're great. Versus assessment for learning. You're assessing the student to help them learn better. So it's not a value judgment on them, or I keep saying value because that's what it feels like, right? When you give them a score, you're judging my value. But if you're micro-assessing them and saying, here's where you are, here's where you're weak at. Look, the biggest growth happens, you need change. People need to change to grow. And you can't change if you don't know where you're weak and strong at. You can't just do what you're strong at all the time. They call it retrieval practice, right? You have to be able to practice constantly. And it doesn't mean like you focus only on your weakness. No, it's a healthy balance of everything, right? And you mix it up. You work on your strengths, but you identify your weaknesses, you neutralize them, and you keep growing. So when you're assessing for the sake of learning versus you're assessing for the sake of assessing where they are, completely changes the process. It makes it more enjoyable.
And I would guess, not having used any of your solutions, but I would guess if the system tells me that my outcome at the end of the class is C, but I should focus on this, and I focus on it and I see it move to a C+, that there's an incentive built in there that becomes a motivational factor in my learning. So I'm seeing if I can move my end outcome up, and eventually when you reach the end, you meet the outcome that the system has predicted. Is that an accurate characterization?
That is an accurate characterization. And I can confidently say what Santa TOEIC is doing is exactly that.
And Santa TOEIC, for listeners, can you explain what Santa TOEIC is?
Yeah, first, Santa, like Santa Claus, Santa. TOEIC is an acronym for the TOEIC exam. This is a professional English examination. Countries like Japan, Korea, Vietnam take the TOEIC exam, not to be confused with the TOEFL. TOEFL is a test that students take to get into US colleges. TOEIC is the test of English for international communications. So what that does is it enables people usually who's graduated from college or grad school who want to go work at Samsung or Toyota to prove to the bosses that my English is proficient for professional environment. That's why they take the TOEIC. So Santa TOEIC, you can call it a test prep program. We've integrated our AI to the TOEIC ecosystem. And if you think about it, test prep is the process of taking mini diagnostics, getting a score, get that feedback, and then you learn and prep towards a higher score. You incrementally try to improve yourself. Now, just take a moment. What if that test prep process became the test score? My father used to love to say, practice like it's the real deal, but make the real deal like practice. So why can't my practice, everything that I've done, all my hard effort, say something about who I am and actually be, quote unquote, the score? So if you think about what Santa TOEIC is doing, essentially, we have to obviously validate everything we're doing with psychometrics and whatnot. And we're in the process of doing it. We've hired a bunch of learning scientists to validate all of this data. Point is, though, if we as a community, the society and nation agree that the learning process, the quote unquote test prep process is valuable, and it says something about the student's final outcome, we should be able to, as a society, replace, quote unquote, that final summative test score with this. We just need the data, right? We just need to be able to quantify it, and AI enables that.
So Santa, what I understand is the developers came up with the name Santa because Santa knows whether all of the children in the world are doing good or bad at any point in time. Is that right?
Yeah, that is correct.
And then they named the API Rudolph, I think. Santa has been the validation of the tech, but now you're taking that family of algorithms and applying it elsewhere outside of the test prep market. And Johan, can you talk a little bit about that, about where the company goes from Santa?
Absolutely. So I think one thing to highlight is a good number of us, either because we happen to have done our PhDs or whatnot, we are actually also teachers. A long, long time ago, I taught for Kaplan as a test prep instructor for a number of their exams. The number of undergraduate students I've turned into medical students is staggering. But, what we're really talking about from a systematic machine learning perspective is you take that learning event session. And just like David was saying, when you start looking about what that learning journey is, that's a longitudinal time series, right? But when you talk about assessment, that's a cross-section of a snapshot at a moment in time. For those of us who are passionate about teaching and passionate about what it means to educate and help students reach their maximum potential, for those of us who've done this concretely and systematically in academic settings, part of that is you want to help the student make that transition from concrete reasoning into abstract reasoning. For those in the physical sciences, a great example of that is linear algebra. They're the kids that pick up linear algebra and run with it, and they're able to get into abstract math. And the ones that struggle with it, they just haven't made that neural rewiring to be able to start thinking in terms of abstraction. And then that transition, that ability to go from concrete and intuitive to abstract and critical reasoning, I mean, that's really what we're trying to do. And so you asked the question, where are we going from the Santa TOEIC and the ability to do rapid AI-enabled test and assessment and preparation? The next part is, as David is getting at, how do you take formative assessment and evolve that into what we call formative learning? And like internally, we've demonstrated the accuracy of score prediction, because just like you said, when you go from that C to the C+, what if now you're able to see, here's the actual pedagogical content you need to learn to get from that C+ to the B+, and that B+ to the A+. And then what if you knew how long it would take? What are all the things that you would have to do to get there? I mean, that's kind of what we've done. We took the accuracy of score prediction models that we did on the assessment side, like we did with Santa TOEIC, we put them into the real world. And just like you said, it would motivate you to get to that next level because you're starting to see what your effort now translates into. One of the great things is that for us, it's actually given us a number of additional, what I call hypothesis generation models, where now we're looking at user engagement, because the user engagement actually feeds into it almost in a perfect virtuous cycle, because we had the empirical evidence from their assessment. We applied our deep attentive neural network models in score prediction. And then when we did the A/B tests, they helped us identify things like student morale. It helped us identify active engagement. And people say, well, how do you define that? How do you classify that? For student morale, one of the things that we know is we had a higher predictive diagnostic test in terms of completion ratios, the number of questions that were answered. When it came to engagement, it usually often translated into a significant increase in purchase rate, conversion rate, and improved total profit with one model versus the other model. I mean, this was one of our earliest papers that came out. The neat thing there was that led to our hypothesis that students would then show higher levels of engagement if they not only experience a more precise score prediction while interacting, but then much, much tighter results. And that was the formation of some of our formal knowledge tracing algorithms. And so this is real, and it makes both intuitive and then also mathematical sense, because what happens is when you start recommending different curriculum for the student to engage on, we know what that conversion ratio is. It's actually a different conversion, not for did they buy the app or did they go into the subscription model. It's did they actually follow through and click through to that content? Did they watch that video or that lecture? Did they watch that video entirely? Did they come back to that video? Because sometimes just rote repetition of seeing the same curriculum presented to you, the curriculum may be the same, but the way your brain processes it becomes more sophisticated over time, because you heard it the first time, then you then reassess based on what you thought you learned and then what you're now seeing again as a reinforcement. And that's been naturally translating to much stronger reinforcement. And so that's the next part of our evolution, which is us formalizing and making that formative learning now more systematic. And then the next phase is even more exciting. It's what we consider career navigation. Because at the end of the day, one way or another, people are trying to do this to better their circumstances, train for that next job, that next position, and then be able to more fully recognize and realize their potential. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. And on that next phase, I mean, you're focused on STEM education, right? Can this be applied to other forms of education?
I'll hand it over to David in a second, but we've been talking about numeracy a lot right now, just intuitively, but there is a significant part of it with literacy, because the TOEIC exam actually is largely a reading and listening exam. And so as a machine learning scientist or as an AI scientist, that immediately takes you into unstructured text, it takes you into audio data, it takes you into visual and video data. And so I'm going to actually hand over to David first, because I think he can craft that. He can explain that in a very compelling way. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's natural because AI is such a quant kind of science to make the jump that, hey, this is very good at assessing the hard sciences, the STEM. TOEIC, as Johan pointed out, is an English assessment. So there is a whole reading and listening element, comprehension element that it assesses. However, our AI scientists like to say is subject agnostic, the AI, because it's all ones and zeros at the end of the day. And we started out with multiple choice exams, right? And so whenever you can assign A, B, C, D, or E to choices already, and then practically any test in the world you can do that with. So it works no matter what subject you are. But now what Johan touched on, which is really, really, really exciting for us, is formative learning and then also just navigation in general, right? Career navigation, purpose navigation. It's the soft parts of learning, if you will. And that too can become broken down. And a very interesting, promising step towards that direction for us is our partnership and collaboration with Stanford SMILE, Stanford Mobile Inquiry-Based Learning Environment. It's being used by millions of students all over the world. Stanford SMILE, it's in Ghana, Puerto Rico, India. And Stanford SMILE's main premise is you can assess or you can know students' creativity and critical thinking ability by the questions they ask. And what if you could, ask a student, this goes in many directions here, not only the question, but what if you asked a student to create their own questions over a period of time? What does that tell us about the student's mastery, understanding, curiosities, the connections they're building and making, or lack thereof? So this is touching on the soft part of learning, if you will. And we've actually started integrating our AI and everything we've learned so far. And I can get into the details about that, like the actual sciences of it, but we're at an exciting juncture where this is not the STEM. This is actually getting at purpose, like you said, and getting at critical thinking and creative thinking in a very, very novel approach by assessing questions or by encouraging students to ask a lot of questions and seeing the flow of their questions over a period of time and what that tells us about the student.
One of my questions is, are you guys focused from the tech side or the product side? Are you focused on K through 12 or post-secondary education or both? And how do you get this into students' hands? Is it by engaging institutions? Is it through a B2C product over the internet?
That's a great question. We started with lifelong learning, right? Professionals, but definitely we see it being applied K through 12, college, graduate school, lifelong learning across the spectrum. Again, we're first approaching businesses, publishers, governments, districts, introducing them to the world of AI, what it can do for them, what solutions it can provide. And it's been very fruitful, actually. We've started 5 months ago to do this. And the fruit of our labor is about to bear. For example, third grade. We've had a state, and the state will go unnamed for now, ask us, is there a way you can predict which students will end up in prison and which won't? And interesting enough, our research so far has been showing us that you have to start as early as third grade reading abilities. And where the third grade reading ability is, right? If you're a ninth grader and you're at a third grade reading ability, what does that say? What kind of correlations can you draw from that? Again, we need a lot more statistical data and patterns to be able to draw some distinctions there. We've had folks who came up to us and asked us to help them replace the entire national exam with this formative learning process. So that's exciting too, right? And then there are the professional real estate exams and the life insurance exams that we rolled out recently. So you can't ask the world to suddenly bite a huge size of our formative learning pattern and paradigm and be okay with it. So we're starting by chipping away at what everyone's comfortable with, which is assessments. We're replacing it with something more friendly, or we're asking them to use our process to prep for the assessment. So it's a very non-threatening approach. It's a very collaborative approach to the B2B community. We are working on some B2C, but not right now. We're not an education company per se. We don't want to come to the playground and say, hey, all you educators, we have better content. That's not what we're about. We're about collaboration. And that's what AI is all about, right? So we want to offer our technology, our discoveries to the education community, collaborate with them. So a B2C would just be if there's no partner out there or no business or no school or government who wants to attack a solution, then we might consider B2C a unique niche of it.
So right now, with public institutions, education ministries or school districts, you're still in the discussion phase. There are no implementations yet. Is that right?
Yeah, we've signed some deals, some MOUs. We're discussing, we're researching, we're showing demos. For example, helping educate the local prison population with a certain learning platform or learning exam. These things are concretely moving forward, or national governments that do want us to replace their national exam. These are actually concretely moving forward.
That idea of identifying children whose pattern fit those who end up in prison is fascinating, because presumably then you could intervene with those children early and reduce the rate of people in those communities going to prison. So, Johan, on strategy, does that mean product strategy or is that market strategy? What parts of strategy you're working on?
This is more around global strategy, how we scale, right? And so, as David was saying, we started out with capabilities around hard assessment modeling, like score prediction, knowledge tracing, et cetera. Then, because those models then shine light into areas such as user behavior, user engagement, then it took us into things like dropout prediction, response rate, retention components. And especially in the post-COVID era, every higher learning education system that we encounter, one of the first questions they always ask us is, how can you help us with dropout prediction? In this type of learning environment now, what's the likelihood of disengagement? Where are we going to start seeing rapid disengagement with the curriculum series, et cetera, et cetera? And so when we got into those components, we had the optimum learning path already in place, because from knowledge tracing, you can then get into really good content recommendation. And from content recommendation, you can figure out what's the likelihood that this particular individual is going to be able to either stick with the program in a persevering model, or is going to chase into the program and dive into it because they're highly engaged and highly enthusiastic about not only their potential, but where the knowledge is much more accessible and almost tuned to the way that the learner absorbs information. One thing that has allowed our company to be as successful as it has been is because the different departments have been so good at working together. So good at wanting to make sure that we think about the it before the we and then the me. And every department in our team, because there's hardworking, brilliant people, they have their own internal strategy. Then the question is, how do we make sure that those internal strategies are being communicated across the board, reconciled with maybe corner case questions or ideas and concerns? And then how do we maintain the cohesion of the company as a whole so that we can all start, one, making sure we're all playing at the same tempo and beat, and then being able to march towards some of our more aspirational objectives. And so, as David mentioned, we are truly a global company. We've got staff in the US, we've got staff in the UK, we have a huge parent company in Korea. When startups grow this fast and this quick, there's always the risk of falling off course. But the same way that we have been formalizing micro-assessment, micro-correction, we're doing the same thing on ourselves. We have to be always asking ourselves and being humble about where we are, where we're trying to go, how we do it, and then remembering that there's the individual aspirations of some of our researchers. There's the we of the department, and then there's the it, which is the company and the product as a whole. And I think we've done a fairly remarkable job of not only keeping everyone in the same pace, but making sure we bring out the best in all of us to then achieve the aspirational things. When teaching and children and the population that we're trying to empower are essentially a vulnerable population, both as children and very susceptible and very open to the concepts that are being taught in an objective, consistent, and scientifically rigorous manner, how do we do what is best for the child? And in this case, how do we do what's best for every child that is going to be a user and a consumer of our tools? We have to come at it almost with a sense of kindness, and we have to do it with intellectual honesty. And even within our company, we have an internal culture of kindness. It's not just a matter of respect. You have to go one layer up, which is how do you be kind to one another when you have two competing algorithms and both of them make a lot of sense, How do you do that in a judicious, rigorous way? Well, A/B testing. Our A/B testing has been able to show incredibly significant gains, both in the user retention, the conversion. So both the science and both the commercial requirements are being met through using objective methodologies and then being kind to one another and saying, hey, maybe not this time, maybe the next round, we'll get it into the next major release. And that's never easy for anyone. But when you're doing it again with true kindness and care and concern for one another so that we can achieve the larger goals, we've been attracting a lot of new candidates simply because we're operating differently than the typical Silicon Valley organization.
On the specific tech, can you talk about the AI Ed Challenge, the Reed AI Ed Challenge, and what that is intended to do? Presumably, you're trying to build a community of researchers focused on education.
That's actually a really great question. So another one of the things that really attracted me to the company was that despite being a startup, they were doing all the right things a multinational AI corporation would do. They were publishing really compelling models and work with really interesting results that generated so many additional hypotheses. As a scientist by training, the intellectual curiosity just lit up like a Christmas tree when I read some of the initial papers. The second thing was they were taking top-of-the-line algorithms. One of them was a transformer algorithm that came out of my alma mater, Google Brain, and then modified and adapted it to our population, which then generated some really interesting results. And then the next thing they did was they published EdNet, which was, and actually still is, the largest open source repository of education data specifically for AI exploration. And to me, that was hugely indicative that this company was doing something really amazing. And then on top of that, we did one further. We launched the AI EdNet Challenge in 2020. It's the inaugural one. It was on October 5th, which called for researchers to design an AI algorithm that improved our ability to predict student performance on multiple choice questions. We powered that with providing our EdNet data set, which is, as I said, the largest public AI education data set in the world. It's got 130 million interactions, 783,000 students. And of course, we put in a $100,000 prize pool. And then the winning teams would be invited to present their model at the AAAI 2021 workshop on AI education. Shortly after I joined the company, we had another great moment of validation when one of our researchers' works was accepted as a dedicated AAAI workshop. Again, further providing empirical evidence that maybe we're onto something here. And in the first 2 weeks of the AI EdNet Challenge, like over 1,000 teams from 85 countries around the world were participating. In just over a month, it became 1,500 teams. And we have 28 Kaggle Grandmasters among our competitors. In other words, 1 in 7 of the 196 Grandmasters on the planet are in our competition.
That data being the largest, it's a moment of pat ourselves on the back and be proud, but actually it shouldn't be. It's stupendously embarrassing for humanity that a small startup, open data, is the largest data set in the world. That's so embarrassing for education, actually, because there's a reason why AI scientists and data scientists are flocking to finance and medicine, biotech, but not to education. It's because we all function in little silos. We're greedy with our little fiefdoms as our data, and we won't open it. And yeah, I get privacy, but medicine has privacy issues too. So does finance. And there are ways to collaborate without violating people's privacy. The fact that we're the first to do this is embarrassing for humanity.
Somebody said to that point that part of the problem is education has always been done with pencils and paper, blackboard and chalk, and you don't capture that data. So it isn't until you have a system like yours that you can capture it. Johan, can you talk at all about, you mentioned the transformer algorithm, where that fits into the stack, and knowledge tracing, where that fits? Presumably there's a family of algorithms that you have working together. Are we talking about 5 algorithms, 100 algorithms? I know that it's hard to draw a line between one block of code and another and say that's an algorithm and that's another algorithm. But generally, can you talk about how many kinds of technologies you're blending?
Yeah, there's certain things I can't reveal, but I think it'd be safe to say there's about a half dozen or so that are kind of like our mainstays. We talked about the emphasis on more the STEM and numeracy components, but some of our key algorithms are actually NLP based, right? And so one of the things that came out early on is long ago when Reed first started, they were using collaborative filtering, classic recommender system, as it makes a lot of sense. If you are likely to be successful in this subject or topic area, you're more likely to be successful in this other one. Or if you're weak in this one, the converse, right? And so the company started out with using collaborative filtering mechanisms. And then when they started in deep learning algorithms, we did a competitive A/B test between our users as they were using the collaborative filtering mechanisms versus the neural net based ones. And then at that time, it was mostly LSTMs. And so we saw significant gains there where students would not only have better retention, better predictive readout in terms of their ability to answer certain tough questions, then that also led into stronger content absorption. And then, of course, on the commercial side, better conversions in terms of going from our free to premium models. Then, as David said, we started breaking down and resolving much more finely and much more discretely the score prediction components within assessment models, the dropout prediction as well, and then correctness. Then, as we started going to unsupervised spaces, sometimes we would not have the accurate scores that came from students taking their exams. And for those of us who have been in the space for a while, those are cold start problems. How to get from 0 to 1, and you have to go from pure user-generated data that's unsupervised, non-labeled. And so that's when the transformers came into play, because we were able to start replacing the RNNs with multi-headed attention inside our transformer. And our published papers get into this in greater depth and detail for our listeners. It allowed us to parallelize and reduce the training time considerably. For me, on the strategic growth path, that meant I could rededicate more of our compute resources back to our researchers. So it's not draining as much purely in the operational aspect. That's kind of where we are today. And we've got some interesting analyses right now coming back and looking at item response theory with BERT. That's kind of where we're headed. If I were to characterize our overall trajectory, the assessment modeling was our first bucket. And we feel fairly confident that we've been able to not only answer that scientifically, but operationalize that in a very robust way. The next part, as David was alluding to, is now transitioning from formative assessment to what we call formative learning. And that's the new set of algorithms that are going to help us better characterize where a student is, where a student should go, and their likelihood of being able to make it through that trajectory. And of course, the engagement components there. Our third family of algorithms we're starting to develop in that career navigation, which involves things like social emotional learning, 21st century skills, getting into resilience, curiosity, and then how to take someone's natural curiosity and accelerate that into much more stable opportunity growth, right? And so that's kind of the three overall buckets of where our machine learning model families reside.
One of the first folks we've brought onto our team is Jim Larimore. He's Chief Officer for Equity and Learning, because equity is such a big part of what we do. We talk about open educational resources, what we call it, OERs. That's a big drive for us. How do we open EdNet to the world? So it's not a business for us per se. We're not approaching it from a business perspective. How do we offer an open education resource for the next generation? So for us, it's a social responsibility, but it's not a business.
That's great, but an underprivileged kid with a single mother in a bad neighborhood, even if they have connectivity and a laptop, the environment is not conducive to them focusing. Do you think the motivational elements of an AI education system can overcome that, or at least find the 1 out of 10 or 50 of those kids who has the self-motivation to persevere despite their environment?
A very nuanced response to a very good question is our AI is delivered primarily through the mobile phone. And mobile phone usage has exceeded the laptop or the desktop. Whether we like it or not, kids, no matter what environment they are in, they all probably own phones. At least in the United States, they do. Now, if we go to somewhere like Africa and we're talking about different equity issues, they don't even have access to these digital devices. So it's a whole other equity challenge we have. But going back to your question about a single mother who has a child who's not in the optimal environment to actually academically or career-wise be on the right trajectory, The thing is, those kids spend a lot of time on the phone. We call them a thumb generation. AI for the first time is unifying that ecosystem. It's introducing the smartphone to the classroom, actually. Up until now, smartphone was a distraction. How does it help learning? No, it's a distraction, but AI is changing that image. But if the students are spending that much time, let's say just 100% of their energy, if we quantify that 100%, like some of it to sleeping, eating, and whatnot, a good 10 to 15% is spent just entertainment, right? Some more. And if we can overtake some of that for education, AI, know how to nudge them. Hey, you're on the toilet seat. Why don't you ask a few questions right before dinner? Hey, guess what other people are eating for dinner around the world? Let's talk, let's engage. The possibilities are endless. And so we're excited. We think it can make a difference. Will it change everything single-handedly? No, that's a little cocky. We think it will make a good difference, though, towards the right direction.
And I can answer that in a couple ways, too. You're asking a question that is actually top of mind for us. Mm-hmm. So first, let's talk about access to technology, right? If we get the app into that mobile environment, we believe that we could find the diamond in the rough. Mm-hmm. Those children who have the right curiosity, interest, the neurological components, the whole late bloomer, early bloomer component, when kids are able to start making that abstract transition and start thinking much more concretely with critical reasoning. I believe critical reasoning absolutely can be taught. The benefits of AI, as David alluded to earlier about the ever-patient instructor who is never judgmental, we call those intelligent tutoring systems. That's essentially what our platform is. Can we identify those youngsters? I believe we can. How we then do that, then from a technology standpoint, we actually spend a considerable amount of thought thinking about what the user endpoint looks like. What is the internet coverage in that area? How can we enhance that? We are actually having discussions with folks who can provide that level of access into developing countries, because that is important for us, not just from equity, but we know that there are not just geniuses, but heavily engaged students who have the capability of realizing their potential through their academic and intellectual curiosity. Traditionally, IT teams have said, okay, we need to support a certain lowest common denominator in the mobile operating system in that region. Because of some of the partners that we talk to, they are able to characterize for us what is the penetration of, let's say, the easiest access Samsung all the way up. We're able to access that. Same thing with what's the overall penetration of smartphones and reasonable broadband within a certain locale. We're able to access that too. And so we've been trying to scale our systems in a way so that we can hit that lowest common denominator, not make bandwidth, not make memory that's local on the device a hurdle. And then how do we present the information in a way that makes sense? And as a husband and a father, for me, privacy, right? One of the big things that I took away from my time at Google is the right to be forgotten. We are actively contemplating, and we already have a design framework already built out on how do we give control to the student and the parents when it comes to their ability to control their data, when to delete it at any time that they want to, because I think technology, especially the black boxes associated with AI, one of the underlying fears is, oh, wait a second, if this is assessing me and I do poorly or my trajectory isn't so good, am I then going to be judged? Am I going to be held against this in the admission for the next primary or secondary education? The answer is no, we cannot allow that, because that's going to create a whole new set of inequity issues. And so for us, we are actively designing and starting to architect what our systems will look like for full transparency and then privacy for the user, especially for our children and then also for our parents, because otherwise we're just creating a new set of problems. And that's something that we keep at top of mind.
That's it for this week's episode. I want to thank David and Johan for their time. If you want to know more about what we talked about today, you can find a transcript of this episode on our website, EyeOnAI, that's EYE-ON.AI. The transcript is scrolling with speed controls so you can run through it quickly. I also encourage you to visit readlabs.ai and attend the AAAI workshop on February 9th. And remember, the singularity may not be near, but AI is about to change your world. So pay attention.